Hello, everyone. Welcome to Discussion of the Week, Philosophical Podcast. This is the first episode of the podcast. The primary focus of this channel will be to open up a dialogue via a philosophical discussion on various topics. These topics will hopefully bring greater awareness of the field of philosophy into the general public discourse. It will be mainly an informal discussion where I'll attempt to zoom in or out from a technical perspective as much as necessary. So at times it'll be a very broad and general discussion, but when needed, going into the very nitty-gritty technical details of things. I'll make you aware of the resources I'm drawing from, what I'm reading and so forth, which as of now I think will rely heavily on academic journal papers. The papers are not readily available to the general public, being hidden behind paywalls and so forth. But I think there must be a market for this kind of thing, since there are so many remarkable papers out there with truly astounding ideas, but they're sitting there with almost zero citations and seemingly very little public awareness. I think mainly due to the fact that they're not very accessible to the average person. However, a lot of these ideas you can find in these papers are not readily available elsewhere, such as in popular philosophy books and so forth. So they are important, and I will draw heavily from these kinds of sources to formulate the discussion of the week. As for the video content itself, I'm open to playing around with it till I find what works, but as for now I'm going to use clips either of what I'm referring to in the discussion, or possibly some other random tasks as just sort of a background that the listener can either watch or ignore as they please. So with that out of the way, let's jump into the topic of the first episode, reason versus intuition in science. So what are the roles of reason, also known as ratiocination, versus unconscious processing in science? So this is a question that has been addressed for a very long time, at least going to the very beginning of the field of psychology in the late 1800s and early 1900s is when it got a lot of attention. But most famously by philosophers such as Michael Polanyi, as well as Thomas Kuhn in his book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. However, to begin with, I wanted to focus in on the work that was done in this area by a famous mathematician named Henri Poincaré. The two papers that I'm currently reading that I'm going to formulate the beginning of this discussion around are Scientific Creativity, a comparative study of Henri Poincaré and Albert Einstein by Arthur I. Miller, as well as the paper Mathematical Creation by Poincaré himself, who wrote a number of papers in this area. So just to give you a general introduction to Poincaré, he was a famous mathematician, actually one of the most famous who's ever lived, and he was operating during the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he was familiar with Einstein. They had some correspondence together. Poincaré didn't favor special relativity when Einstein first developed it. He thought Einstein's observations led to some different conclusions, but obviously he was proven wrong about that in the end. So he was a good influence with physics, but his greatest accomplishments were in mathematics. And he wrote several papers about the process of mathematical creation. And his general thesis was that your unconscious mind is better at mathematics than your conscious mind. So he had noticed that when he actually sat down to solve a mathematical problem, to try and develop some mathematical proof for an existing unsolved problem, he found that when he actually sat down and, consciously thought about and reasoned through and worked at the problem and went through logical acrobatics in his mind, he found that he could rarely solve a mathematical problem in this way. But How he most often solved the problem was when he was doing something completely unrelated to mathematics. The answer or the proof to a formula would just pop into his head spontaneously. Now, there are a few different occasions where this happened that he explains about in more detail in his papers. So his thesis ended up being that his subconscious mind was actually better or superior to his conscious mind, because his conscious reasoning was a waste of effort and time most often, whereas when he would stop thinking about a problem, his intuition of the unconscious mind would solve the problem way faster than him sitting down and actually thinking about the problem itself. Now, before I continue, this area of philosophy of science has often been considered pretty much a fringe kind of subject, but I'm really at a loss as to why, because to me it seems like one of the most important questions in all of the philosophy of science, and it links right back to the work of Karl Popper and induction through Michael Polanyi and Thomas Kuhn's criticisms of that. And just in general, how does the mind solve a scientific problem actually? And is this process of analytical reasoning actually coming that much into play? Or is it more just of a story that we're telling ourselves of this is how we do it, even though something completely different is going on? So there's been many scientists other than Poincaré who have also pointed this out, that they felt that intuition was playing one of the most important roles in their scientific discoveries and their creative processes. Many reports of either solving a problem after just waking up from sleep, the answer just comes into your head, either dreaming about the solution to a problem, such as most famously Kekule's dream, where this chemist Kekule, he had a dream about a snake, the Ouroboros, wrapping itself into a ring, and there was various other aspects to this dream, but it basically solved the structure of the benzene molecule. After he awoke, he realized that the snake was showing him the actual cyclical structure of the benzene ring. So I also have a personal stake in this problem, since I've also worked as a scientist in a lab and I've solved various scientific problems, and the way in which the solutions came to me appeared to happen in a very similar way to what Henri Poincaré and many other famous scientists in the past have described. And what it really comes down to is the question of what is the nature of the creative process itself? What is the nature of sudden inspiration, whether it's by the author of a fictional book, a story, who suddenly has these inspirations as to the characters in the storyline, or whether it's a painter who has a sudden inspiration and creates a masterpiece, and how these other areas relate back to the creative process in science. Are they identical processes? Is there any difference? Does science uniquely rely on this process of reason, which is kind of the, if you will, storybook scientific method that we're told growing up throughout schooling and so forth? And this debate goes way outside of the philosophy of science itself. I mean, there were philosophers such as Michael Oakeshott, the famous conservative philosopher, who believed that ratiocination, that's where I got that word from, actually it was from him, was an inferior process of thinking. So that he thought the actual reasoning process itself was inferior to other ways of deriving knowledge from experiencing reality, as well as people like the Russian Jewish philosopher Lev Shestov, who thought that this obsession with logic and reason of the West was sort of like a mental illness, so to speak. So the first paper I'm going to address is the one which is a comparative study of the creative processes of Einstein versus Poincare. And I'm just going to read a little blurb so you get an idea of how important Poincare was. He had published approximately 500 papers and 30 books in his lifetime. He received numerous honorary degrees and every scientific prize except the Nobel Prize. He took all knowledge to be his province, so he believed that he had a right to play in any space that he came across. When it came to discovering new knowledge, he made significant contributions to every branch of physics and astronomy, as well as formulating a unique viewpoint of the philosophy of science, which is the point of this paper, discussing his views on the role that intuition plays in science and the unconscious processing of the mind. Here is an important quotation in a section titled "The Personal Side." He exhibited an early talent for mathematics, and Poincare had demonstrated tenacity for continuous work on a problem, a trait common to genius. So there's a first clue that you have to be able to have this tenacity and this trait of being able to work on a problem continuously, first of all, in order for these intuitions to be able to happen. But it's not just hard work and persistence either. I mean, it's not the case that you could have a room full of monkeys hitting on a bunch of typewriters, and if you left them there long enough, they would produce, some of Shakespeare's works, such as Hamlet, just by statistical chance. It's just the bare statistical mechanics of it. I don't actually believe that, and it's not just persistence itself, but there is some quality, such as raw talent or instinct, that is going into the ability to be able to solve these problems. And actually separating these categories of talent versus instinct versus intuition is a very difficult task in itself, which I'm not going to attempt to tackle at this point. We're just going to have to accept that they're kind of intermingled concepts. Another crucial insight in this paper from Arthur Miller is that both Einstein and Poincare considered scientific thought to be the next step in evolution after pre-scientific thought. So just going along with what we talked about with this genius requiring this tenacity to just stick with a problem. If you think about like the alchemists from the medieval times and this obsession with the philosopher's stone, with transmuting elements into gold and so forth, and the secrecy and the obsession and the mystique behind it, you can kind of get an idea of how this sort of attitude that evolved at some time during these Middle Ages was required to eventually result in the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. This just attitude of obsession and sticking with a fixed idea, being fixated on things. And it's tough to say, but Christianity and how it evolved through the Dark Ages probably had a lot to do with the evolution of this attitude, with, the asceticism of monks and this intense focus. None of that was existing in the ancient world, and that's probably the reason that a scientific revolution didn't happen at that time, because this sort of predisposition did not exist at that time. It hadn't evolved yet. I mean, being honest about this, Isaac Newton wouldn't have been the father of mechanics if he weren't already obsessed with understanding the mind of God, understanding, the greater plan of things. And he was also deeply interested in alchemy as well. And that sort of method of thinking of these alchemists of the Middle Ages, that's what led to the the scientific mind of the Enlightenment. Without the former, you would have never had the latter, and you can't place more importance on one epoch over the other. It's like the same as a child's developmental stages. They go through different stages that are distinct, and if it weren't for the former, you wouldn't ever have the latter. So another point of interest is that this famous psychologist, Toulouse, or something like that, he studied various accomplished men of his time, trying to figure out the process of creativity and come up with a theory behind it. So he studied like Émile Zola, the author, Poincaré, as well as a couple famous sculptors, and he took notes on them. And one of the curious things was that Poincaré suffered from synesthesia, so when he heard sounds, he associated it with the quality of feeling a color, as well as Poincaré was not good at rote memorization. So if you asked him to solve a simple problem that most people would solve using memorization, he would attempt to solve the problem via some first principles that he could come up with and reason from there. Toulouse had reported that Poincaré worked at his desk specifically on mathematical research for not more than 4 hours per day, from 10 a.m. to noon and 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. It was a rigid schedule where the evenings were reserved for reading other journal articles. This was not uncommon for mathematicians. G.H. Hardy worked only from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., whereupon he retired to the cricket field. When writing a paper, Poincaré used neither notes nor did he have any definite overall plan or goal in mind, or even any idea of whether the problem was soluble. This is research at its most fundamental. So again, this is a quote from the paper. As Toulouse reported from an interview with Poincaré, he does not make a grand plan when he writes a paper. Ordinarily, he starts it without knowing where he will conclude. Starting is generally easy, then he seems led by his work and has not the impression of any willful effort. At that moment, it is difficult to distract him. When he searches, he often writes a formula automatically in order to awaken some association of ideas. If the starting is painful, Poincaré does not persist and abandons the started work, in contrast to Zola, who persists. This is why he has no patience. In certain work, Poincaré proceeds by sudden blows, taking and abandoning a subject. During intervals, he assumes that his unconscious continues the work of reflection. Cessation of work is difficult if there is not a sufficiently strong distraction, especially in the case where the work is not judged complete. It is for this reason that Poincaré never does any important work in the evening in order not to trouble his sleep. It is a method of work uncommon in scientific matters, and it constitutes a character well suited to the mental activity of Poincaré. The style of most of Poincaré's 500 publications bear out Borel's description. Many are short articles in the Compte Rendu, where Poincaré either opens a new field or stunningly solves a long-standing problem. Most of them contain typos owing to Poincaré's impatience with proofreading, a trait observed by Toulouse in tests. Toulouse recounted that Émile Borel, the distinguished mathematician and colleague of Poincaré, characterized Poincaré as a constructor, a realizer, more conqueror than colonizer, leaving to others the task of organizing his discoveries. Note Poincaré's complete confidence in his power of unconscious work, which comes about through a play of associations in the manner of network thinking. Now, network thinking is a term that Arthur Miller is introducing in this paper. He has a description of it earlier in the paper, but I didn't want to go into it right away. I'll go back to his description of network thinking later. But essentially, it is a sort of mechanism of intuition. And he believes that that is partially to explain for Poincaré's unconscious ability to solve mathematical problems. So Toulouse also wrote, Poincaré's memory and faculty of assimilation and comprehension of the most varied things, mathematics, physical sciences, philosophy, literature, languages, permitted him to examine problems in diverse ways. I think it's useful to continue reading some more passages from this manuscript. Examination of Poincaré's unpublished manuscripts revealed the results of concentrated efforts of 4 hours of work per day by someone of his caliber. Incredibly, he could work through page after page of detailed calculations, be it of the most abstract mathematical sort, or calculating numbers, as he often did in physics, hardly ever crossing anything out. He literally skimmed the cream off the top of research areas, leaving others the task of rigorization, while he moved on to greener pastures. Skipping down, this mode of work explains Poincaré's incredible rate of production of discoveries, and as Poincaré reported to Toulouse, it reflects his repugnance for administrative or practical tasks. His doodling on memos for faculty meetings are ample proof of this opinion. He worked everywhere. Today, mathematicians agree that many of Poincaré's papers are still not completely understood and promise new riches. For example, the relevance of his research on so-called dynamical systems has been realized only recently in the burgeoning field of chaos. Space vehicles are launched and their orbits calculated with Poincaré's formulation of celestial mechanics from his classic and still read some French title. It is no exaggeration to say that Poincaré completed Newtonian mechanics. So that's all for the first episode of this podcast and of this series. If you enjoyed this content, please stay tuned for more episodes on other topics, as well as the continuation of this series, which will be a multi-video series. And thank you for joining me. If you agree or disagree with any of the opinions expressed here, feel free to leave your opinion in the comments to continue the discussion of the week. Thank you, and have a great day.